player has a release clause in their contract, it means that they can leave a club for an agreed fee. Sometimes there are events that trigger clauses, relegation perhaps, or a specific period of time within the contract's duration. Sometimes a release clause is only valid for a certain period of time, or after several years of a contract has already elapsed. So there are many variations, but in their fundamental sense, they are feared. If activated, they leave clubs powerless to resist as one of their players is snatched away. Well, that's one perspective, yes. Another is that they can actually be a good thing for selling clubs. So firstly, why do players have release clauses? Well, in Spain, it's compulsory. All La Liga players have them, and many of those are so ridiculous as to be virtually token. For instance, the release clause in Karim Benzema's Real Madrid contract is a reported €1 billion, and nobody is likely to pay that anytime soon. But it's there because it has to be. Elsewhere, it's really a mechanism by which a player can retain control over their future. When an interested club is willing to meet the agreed price, then the player is able to negotiate with them and agree a transfer. It's a means of ensuring clarity and of guarding against broken promises or unrealistic asking prices. Erling Haaland is a very good example of this. When he left RB Salzburg in the winter of 2020, it was already clear that he was likely headed for the very top of the game. And yet he signed for Borussia Dortmund, who, while still a major club, were clearly a level below other interested parties, among them Manchester United. The Dortmund were the right club for him at the right point of his career, but only as a stepping stone. The solution was to agree a contract that included a €60 million release clause that would become active after 2 years, from 2022 onwards. It meant that he was able to further his experience and develop in a major European league, but without either the pressure of an immediate jump from Austrian football to a Champions League contender, or the risk of becoming a prisoner of his own talent. Haaland moved to Manchester City ahead of the 22-23 season after the Premier League club activated his release clause. Had his contract not contained one, Dortmund would have been within their rights to demand a fee 3 or 4 times higher. And from the perspective of Haaland and his representatives, his options would have been limited to the very few clubs who could afford that kind of fee, if any at all. It's a good example of how release clauses help to create and protect a player's career progress. Now for clubs, particularly those who are selling, it's a different proposition. We'll get onto the positives, but the negatives, they're self-evident. If a player has a release clause, it limits their agency. They are unable to reject offers beyond a certain value. The price is the price. Above it, there is no negotiation and no potential for other suitors to create an auction. The seller also has less control of how a sale may take place. Famously, Borussia Dortmund found out that Mario Götze was leaving the club when, in the middle of their run to the Champions League final in 2013, Götze's agent rang Hans-Joachim Watzke to inform him that Bayern Munich would be activating Götze's release clause that summer. But there is another side to this coin. Release clauses give advance notice that a player will have to be replaced. On allowing a release clause in a contract, any sensible club would immediately begin their preparation for a departure. That needn't mean they scout identical players, but it still provides the opportunity for successful succession planning and rewards clubs with strong recruitment. In 2021, RB Leipzig lost Dayot Upamecano and Ibrahima Konate to Bayern Munich and Liverpool respectively, after both players had their release clauses activated. Upamecano's move was confirmed in February, and Konate's move would be announced in May. But tellingly, Leipzig had already announced the signing of Josko Gvardiol from Dinamo Zagreb back in November of 2020, and the addition of Mohamed Simakan from Strasbourg in the spring of 2021. Leipzig knew what they would be losing and when, helping them to have 2 instant starters signed for the next year, long before pre-season even began. Another advantage with release clauses is budgetary. The bigger the sale, the better, of course, but if an important player has a predefined value, then the replacement process can be started earlier and can potentially be expedited in a way that limits disruption and discord. In the summer of 2021, Manchester City offered £100 million to Aston Villa to activate Jack Grealish's release clause. The deal would be completed on the 5th of August, almost a month after Emi Buendia had joined from Norwich City, and 24 hours after the club had announced the arrival of Bayer Leverkusen's Leon Bailey and Southampton's Danny Ings. Villa were attempting to replace Grealish by committee, and on the night that his move was confirmed, the club's CEO Christian Purslow was even able to release a video explaining that strategy, while pointing at 3 excellent players who'd already been acquired for £83 million. That helped with the optics, certainly, and calmed a fan base which would otherwise have been deeply unhappy. More importantly, with a clear idea of what Grealish was going to be sold for, Villa most likely knew what they could spend. And that is quite unusual. In situations where players have no release clauses and aren't for sale, clubs are unrealistic. They hold out hope of convincing a player to stay, then see them depart late in the window following a lot of acrimony and disruption, and after weeks having already elapsed. They then condense the process of replacing the player into whatever time they have left, often with less than efficient results. A pertinent example of that occurred in the summer of 2008, when Tottenham spent their off-season trying to convince Dimitar Berbatov to remain at the club against his will. When he was eventually sold, on the very last day of the transfer window, they may have received £30 million from Manchester United, but left their squad with just 2 senior forwards. With no time left, the best they were able to do was take Fraser Campbell on loan as part of the Berbatov deal. Campbell had never scored a Premier League goal and had just a handful of top-flight appearances to his name. They resisted, but in a way that ultimately made a bad situation worse. In contrast, release clauses make things very black and white. They prevent exactly that kind of struggle, and they also ensure that less time is consumed by melodrama. Not every footballer develops to the point of being worth their release clause, obviously not, but for those who do, their transfers involve very little club-to-club negotiation. Instead of a game of figurative poker that drags on through an entire window, a buying club is either willing to meet a release clause or they're not. The result is a much cleaner and quicker process, and that is very much in the selling team's interest. While they'd still be losing a key component of their team, the sale process doesn't involve threats to strike, leaks to the media, or any other behaviour associated with want-away players. And because there's no real negotiation to speak of, there's no value to either club in creating a protracted saga which can distract and dishearten those players who are staying at the club, and annoy supporters who want to see progress. Instead, it's often a clean break. So, while granting players release clauses in their contracts is a concession and clearly limits revenue, it's an invitation for clubs to be realistic, proactive, and well prepared. In fact, handled correctly, it's a means of ensuring that new eras begin before old ones come to an end.